Now, if you're heading to New England and you're looking for a memorable experience for the entire family, we have an excellent suggestion for you. Maine's narrow gauge railroads will fascinate the history buffs, the train fans, nature lovers, the kids, and anybody who likes to look at beautiful and interesting scenery.
From the late 1800s until just about World War II, in the state of Maine, there was a unique system of railroads that ran on rails only 2 feet apart. These railroads, called narrow gauge railroads, linked rural Maine to the rest of the Northeast and to the rest of the world. These smaller and usually steam-powered trains shipped everything from passengers and crops to building supplies. And they pulled Maine from the horse-drawn buggy days into modern times. Narrow gauge was cheaper to build than the larger standard gauge railroad, and it allowed for sharper turns in the mountains and valleys. And it was an economical way to move things in and out of remote locations.
The 2-foot railroad gauge was very important to Maine. It was a small scale that fit the economy of the state. It was a very low population state, so there wasn't a big financial base here. And these small 2-foot gauge trains enabled the interior of Maine to develop its agricultural business and its timber business. So it was a real economic engine for the development of interior Maine. It was also, of course, passenger, but even more so, it lumbered out the interior of the state and provided access to markets of their agricultural products.
Obviously, these little 2-foot gauge railroads had to transfer at their connection with a wide gauge railroad, the Maine Central. And that's expensive. So when highway competition became common in the 20s and 30s, these little 2-foot gauge railroads became too expensive to operate. So the truckers took over. And that was the end. They were important to the community because they would not have had a railroad otherwise. The railroads, the big railroads, the standard gauge railroads had gone as far as they wanted to, and they were not interested in going any farther and reaching out into communities that didn't promise enough business.
Narrow gauge may be mostly gone, but in Maine it is certainly not forgotten. History comes alive at the Boothbay Railway Village in Boothbay, Maine. It is indeed a museum, but it's a real village spread out over 30 beautiful rural acres. There are historical buildings and antique cars, but the star attraction is the narrow gauge railroad, especially the Henschel steam locomotives.
Here at the Boothbay Railway Village, we have 4 Henschels. We have 2 of them that are currently in service. One was built in 1934. The other one that we have online today was built in 1913. They are German and European, and they are delightful engines. They're extremely well made, and we have a great time operating them and maintaining them. These engines travel around our track, our 3/4 mile track, and probably during the course of a year put about 2,000 miles on our locomotives without ever actually leaving our property. They operate at 150 psi, and they are very serviceable and very fine engines. We have a very unique situation here at the Boothbay Railway Village in that we have what's called a code restoration shop. We currently have the ability to not only build and fabricate, but repair steam boilers for locomotives. We also have the ability to work on reprofiling flanged wheels, working on running gear, machining bearings, and doing calculations on boilers to meet code requirements. The Merci car is a great story. Back in 1949, the French people gave to the United States a thank you train made up of 49 cars. And 48 of them went to the contiguous states at that time, and the 49th was shared between Washington, D.C. and the territory of Hawaii. Maine's car is here at the Boothbay Railway Village, and it is a great example of international cooperation. This car is built in 1884, and the numbers 40 and 8 refer to its cargo. it could either carry 40 men or 8 horses. Be sure not to do them both at the same time.
Not far from Booth Bay, in the great city of Portland, is yet another place where you can step into the time tunnel and get an appreciation for the past. The Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad Company and Museum offers magnificent views of Portland's working waterfront aboard antique rail cars pulled by hard-working steam and diesel locomotives. The locomotives are as hard-working as the employees. On a typical round trip, the firemen will have to shovel about 200 pounds of coal into the firebox. This takes you on a 1/2-hour, 2-mile-long round trip down memory lane. This railroad was built by volunteers in the mid-1990s on right-of-way now owned by the state of Maine.
The Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad is an indoor-outdoor museum that interprets the history, Maine's industrial history, primarily through the operation of this very rare 2-foot narrow gauge. Our guest engineering program invites as many as 4 people a day to come and learn the firing up and driving engineering specifics of our steam engines.
In the world of railroading, narrow gauge is a diminutive workhorse, once capable of pulling small towns from one era into the next, still capable of creating lasting memories for those in search of a unique experience.